Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to try to untangle a true crime story that I know a lot of you are already familiar with, the Black Dahlia case. Picture it, 1947, Los Angeles, Hollywood dreams, but also, this hidden dark side. And that's where we meet Elizabeth Short, a young woman whose life was cut way too short. And we've got a whole bunch of sources to help us understand this case. We've got, encyclopedia entries, historical articles, even some peeks into the FBI files.
It's a case that's really gripped people for years, and I think part of it is just the brutality of the crime, the media frenzy that just exploded around it, and of course the fact that to this day it remains unsolved. It's a story that kind of, I think, speaks to some of our deepest fears, but also this fascination we have with the unknown.
Exactly. I mean, how can you not be fascinated by this case? We're going to try to piece together Elizabeth Short's life, understand the details of her murder, and maybe, try to understand why this case still just captures our imaginations. So, starting at the beginning, who was Elizabeth Short, the woman who became known as the Black Dahlia?
Well, she wasn't always a Hollywood hopeful. She was born in Boston in 1924, one of 5 daughters. And her early life was actually full of challenges. She had these respiratory issues. Her family had to move to Florida for a while because of them. And then, when she was just 6, her father disappeared.
Wow.
Yeah, he ended up in California. But you can imagine what that kind of abandonment does to a young girl.
Absolutely.
And it's like tragedy just kept following her.
Mm.
During the war, she got engaged, but her fiancé was killed in a plane crash in 1945.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Major Matthew Gordon Jr.
That's awful.
But even with all that, Elizabeth still wanted to make it in Hollywood. She moved to LA in 1946, worked as a waitress, tried to, get those silver screen breaks, but it never really happened for her.
And then comes January 15th, 1947. Her story takes a really dark turn.
A woman and her kid, they're walking through Leimert Park, and they find Elizabeth's body just lying in this vacant lot. It was horrific.
I can only imagine. The crime scene photos, they're...
It was like something out of a nightmare. Her body had been cut in half, completely drained of blood, and posed. The killer even gave her a Glasgow smile. These cuts from the corners of her mouth up towards her ears. The LAPD, they had never seen anything like it.
It's just so disturbing. And it's no wonder this case became a media sensation almost immediately.
Oh, yeah.
The press jumped on this story, headlines day after day, and it feels like they couldn't resist sensationalizing the details. And wasn't it during all that craziness that the name Black Dahlia first appeared?
Yeah, it did. Some people say it came from this 1946 film noir, The Blue Dahlia. Others say it's because Elizabeth always wore black.
Oh, okay.
But however it started, the name stuck. It really overshadowed who Elizabeth Short actually was and turned her into, this grim symbol.
It's amazing and a little unsettling how the media can do that, shape a whole narrative, even if it kind of buries the real story of the victim. How much of what we think we know about Elizabeth Short is actually true, and how much is just media hype?
Right, exactly. So it's so important to remember she was a real person with a life and dreams and people who loved her. She wasn't just a headline. The media, well, they definitely played a part in her story, but we have to look beyond that and try to understand who she really was.
Okay, so let's talk about the investigation. How did the LAPD even approach a case like this, something so shocking, so complex?
Well, first of all, the scale of this thing was massive. Over 750 investigators from the LAPD. You had sheriff's deputies, even the California Highway Patrol. They were all over LA. Storm drains, riverbeds, you name it, trying to find anything that could lead them to the killer.
Wow, 750. That's a lot of manpower. You'd think with that many people they would have found something, right?
Yeah, but you have to remember all that media attention we talked about.
Right.
It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept the case in the public eye, so more tips, maybe more witnesses coming forward. But on the other hand, it created this flood of false leads and confessions.
Oh, right.
Over 500 people confessed to this crime.
Wow.
It shows you how much this case captured people's imaginations, but it also created a lot of noise for the investigators to sift through.
Yeah, I get it. And then on top of that, you have those letters, those creepy letters sent to the press, supposedly from the killer.
Oh, yeah.
Written in that cut and paste style, cleaned with gasoline like Elizabeth's body, even containing some of her things. Were those letters actually from the killer?
Nobody knows for sure.
Really?
Some experts think they were genuine, because of the gasoline, the details in the letters, but others think it was all a hoax, just to taunt the police, to make the case even bigger. Without knowing who wrote them, it's hard to say what they really mean. Did they help the investigation or hurt it? Who knows? But they definitely made things more complicated.
So we've got a brutal crime, media going crazy, a mountain of false leads. Talk about a challenging investigation.
Exactly. And to make things even more difficult, let's talk about the suspects. There were a lot of them.
Right. With all the attention on this case, there must have been a few who really stood out, right?
Yeah. Over the years, there have been a lot of names, but the case is still unsolved.
Hmm.
One of the most interesting is this guy, George Hodel, a doctor.
Oh, wow.
His own son, a former LAPD homicide detective, actually accused him after he died.
What?
Yeah, and a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, but there were some pretty disturbing details. Like, there's this wiretap recording from a grand jury in 1949, and you hear Hodel say, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia."
Whoa, that's pretty incriminating.
Yeah, but still not enough.
Yeah.
And then there's Leslie Dillon. He worked as a mortician's assistant.
Oh, wow. Okay.
A writer named P.U. Eatwell. She has a book called Black Dahlia, Red Rose, and she thinks Elizabeth was killed because of a robbery gone wrong. Like, Dillon and his buddies were involved, Elizabeth knew too much, and they had to shut her up.
Okay, so we've got a doctor with a pretty suspicious statement and a mortician's assistant mixed up in a robbery.
Yeah, it sounds like something straight out of, a film noir.
It does. But neither of those guys, they were never actually linked to the crime.
Right. There were investigations and some interesting theories, but nothing concrete. Which brings us back to the main question. Why is this case still unsolved?
It's the question, isn't it? I mean, you've got so much misinformation swirling around, a crime scene that was practically scrubbed clean, and then a killer who seems like they were always a step ahead of the police.
Yeah, it was like they were playing a deadly game of cat and mouse.
Exactly. And with that, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the theories about why this case is still unsolved, and maybe dig into some of those myths and misconceptions that have popped up over the years. Stay tuned. We're back, and I have to say, thinking about Hodel and Dillon, it almost feels like the killer was trying to throw the investigation off on purpose.
Oh, it's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
And this case is just full of those little details, those things that make you wonder.
Right.
Like, we talked about the crime scene, but what about the autopsy? What did that tell the investigators?
Right. We talked about how horrific it all was.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Short's body was, so badly mutilated, but could any of those details, give the police any real clues about who did this?
Well, the autopsy was done by this guy, Dr. Frederick Newbar, and it showed, a disturbing level of precision. Like the way her body was cut in half, it wasn't just random violence. They used a specific technique, a hemicorporectomy.
Oh, what?
A hemicorporectomy. It's a cut made at the lumbar spine.
Okay, hold on. That sounds, that's really specific. Are you saying the killer might have had, medical training?
It's a theory the investigators looked into.
Right.
They even got lists of students from USC's medical school. It's not far from where they found Elizabeth's body.
Yeah.
But even with all that, it was a dead end.
Wow. That's a chilling thought. Were there any other clues at the crime scene? Like anything useful?
There was a heel print, some tire tracks, and a cement sack with watery blood in it.
Okay.
Potentially useful, but a lot of the evidence was, it was compromised.
Because of the gasoline, right?
Yeah.
The killer was obsessed with wiping everything down.
Exactly. Even Elizabeth's purse and one of her shoes, they found those miles away from the crime scene. And even those had been wiped with gasoline.
Wow.
Makes you think, was it about fingerprints? Or were they just trying to taunt the police?
Right. Almost like they were showing off that they knew how police work. Okay, so thinking about the killer's motives, let's go back to those letters sent to the press. Is there anything that actually proves those were from the killer?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It's haunted this case for years. Some experts are totally convinced they're real. They point to that gasoline thing again. The fact that the letters were cleaned, just like Elizabeth's body and the purse and the shoe. It's a connection,
Right.
A level of, planning.
Right. But couldn't someone have sent those letters just to mess with the investigation, throw the police off, or just because they were, messed up and liked the attention?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so frustrating.
Right.
You don't know who wrote them. They're just another piece of this puzzle we can't figure out.
Yeah.
Maybe they tell us about the killer's mind. Maybe they're a total distraction.
It's amazing how every single detail, the letters, the way she was, everything just leads to more questions. Okay, what about all those rumors and myths that have been around for years? Are there any that really need to be debunked?
Well, one of the big ones is this idea that the Black Dahlia case is connected to the Cleveland torso murders.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. Weren't those in Ohio?
Yeah, back in the 30s.
Right.
They were really gruesome. A lot of victims were dismembered, and those cases are still unsolved, too.
So because they're both unsolved and involve, bodies being cut up, people started making a connection.
Exactly. There were some investigations into a link, but the LAPD, they eventually just dismissed it. And then there's all the stuff about Elizabeth Short's personal life, the rumors about her being, promiscuous or lesbian.
You already talked about that. The rumor she was a prostitute, it's totally false.
Right, and there's no proof for those her claims about her personal life either. It's all based on these harmful stereotypes, and they were really common back then.
It's a good reminder to, be careful about what we believe, especially with a case like this. You have to look at the facts and not, just repeat harmful things about people, especially the victim.
I agree. Elizabeth Short was a real person. She deserves to be remembered for who she was, not for these rumors.
Like you said before, the woman behind the legend. But that's hard with a case as mysterious as this one.
It's true. The Black Dahlia case, it's like a puzzle with so many missing pieces. And it makes you wonder, what was it like for the investigators back in 47, trying to make sense of it all?
Right. No DNA, no fancy forensics, fingerprints wiped clean, the media all over them. I bet it was overwhelming.
It was a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And to make things even worse, some people think the investigation might have been messed up because of corruption in the LAPD itself.
Like a real Hollywood cover-up.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But there's really no proof. Still, it's interesting to think about, isn't it?
It's like this case reflects that whole, dark side of Hollywood, the stuff you see in those old film noir movies.
Yeah, glitz and glamour on the outside, something darker underneath.
Exactly.
But the Black Dahlia case embodies that contrast.
It really does.
And maybe that's part of why it's so fascinating, even now. It reminds us that things aren't always what they seem. Even in a bright place, there can be darkness lurking in the shadows.
We're back, and honestly, after going through all of this, the biggest question I have is, why is this case still unsolved? After all these years, what are some of the main things that you think kept investigators from cracking this case?
It really is the question. It's puzzled everyone for decades, and there isn't, one simple answer. But there are definitely some key factors.
What about all those false leads and confessions we talked about earlier? That must have been so hard for to sort through all of that.
Yeah, imagine trying to find one tiny, super important piece of information in a room that's completely full of distractions. That's basically what those false leads were. Just too much information, and it definitely slowed down the investigation.
And then there's that whole thing with the crime scene itself, right? We talked about how the killer cleaned Elizabeth's body and moved it, so I must have really struggled to find any decent forensic evidence.
Yeah, not having that original crime scene, the place where the murder actually happened, it's a huge problem. It's like trying to solve a puzzle. When you're missing half of the pieces, you can't really understand what happened, how the killer moved, or, what evidence they might have left behind.
Right. Plus, we have to think about forensic science back then, right? This was 1947. No DNA testing, none of the fancy stuff we have today.
Yeah, fingerprinting was pretty much it back then. And even that wasn't reliable in this case. The killer used gasoline, wiped everything down, so even if there were fingerprints, a lot of them would have been unusable. Almost like they were trying to erase themselves on purpose.
That's pretty creepy. It's like they were playing mind games with the police almost. Are there any other things you think might have contributed to this whole thing going cold?
Well, there are some other theories out there. One that pops up a lot is the idea that there was corruption within the LAPD. Some people think that maybe, some officers were protecting someone involved and it messed up the investigation.
The classic Hollywood cover-up. But is there really any evidence for that?
Honestly, it's mainly speculation. Hollywood and rumors go hand in hand. It's a good story, but there's no real proof. Still, it's an interesting thing to think about, adds another layer to this whole thing.
It really does. It's like the case itself, it mirrors that dark side of Hollywood that we see in those old films, those film noir movies. where nothing is what it seems and secrets can be dangerous.
Exactly. That duality, the glamour and the darkness, the Black Dahlia case, it's kind of a perfect example of that. I think that's why it still fascinates people. It forces us to think about the good and bad in people and just how much we don't know about each other.
It really is fascinating and frustrating too. So here we are, all these years later, asking the same questions, still drawn to this crime that just doesn't have a clear answer. Do you think, is there any chance at all, that the Black Dahlia case will ever be solved?
Honestly, it's really hard to say. Every year that passes, the trail gets colder, people forget things, evidence fades away. It's a real race against time.
I know, but part of me, I want to believe that maybe, just maybe, something new will turn up. Some new information, a new way of looking at things, and we'll finally get those answers.
That's what's so great about mysteries, right?
Yeah.
They keep us guessing, keep us hoping. And who knows, maybe one day, technology, it'll get to a point where we can look at the old evidence in a new way and find something that was missed before.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into the Black Dahlia case. We've looked at Elizabeth Short's life, talked about the horrible details of her murder, the craziness of the media, and the suspects who were looked at over the years. We've even gone over some of the myths and talked about why this case might still be unsolved after all this time.
Yeah, we've done a lot.
We have. But this is really just the beginning. The Black Dahlia case, it's like a huge web, so many twists and turns, dead ends. And I think that's what keeps people coming back to it.
It's true. It's a case that really makes you think.
It does. So keep researching, keep exploring all those different ideas about the case, and see what you think.
Maybe you'll find something that everyone else has missed. You never know.
Until next time, stay curious. The truth is out there, just waiting to be discovered.